The Su-39 is a premium pack vehicle in War Thunder. Is it worth it? Let's find out. Over the years since its introduction, the basic Su-25 design has been modernized, upgraded, and produced in a variety of specialized versions. The Su-25UB was a two-seat combat-capable trainer variant that changed the layout of the forward fuselage to add a second cockpit in tandem, while still retaining the full weapon system of the baseline Su-25. This served as the basis for several later versions, including the UBM, UBK, and UTG models. All of these were basically just armed trainers, with some minor variations for specific roles. For example, the UTG was modified for use on an aircraft carrier. The Su-25T was a single-seat modification of the two-seat design, which removed the second cockpit and replaced it with more electronic equipment, an upgraded combat computer, and new navigation equipment. It provided compatibility with a more broad range of weapons, and it was intended specifically as an anti-tank version of the basic Su-25. This led to the Su-25TM, which was later renamed Su-39. This third-generation revision first flew in 1991 and included further upgrades to the electronics, the ability to carry a radar set externally in a pod, compatibility with anti-shipping missiles, and refined airframe armor. Very few Su-39s have been produced, less than a dozen according to most sources, and it's not known for sure if they were ever used in combat. This line of modifications to the Su-25 was abandoned in the mid-2000s, as the all-new technology packed into the jet made the plane incredibly expensive, and given the general vulnerability of close air support jets, it was figured to be a pretty poor financial investment. So work was refocused on producing a modern upgrade package based on the original single-seat airframe that would bring the Su-25 up to modern standards at a lower cost. According to multiple primary sources, the remaining Su-39s were not scrapped and are still in service with the Russian Air Force. What we get in War Thunder is the Su-39, a premium strike jet in rank 7 of the Soviet and Russian tech tree with a battle rating of 11.3. This jet gets a fully featured ballistics computer with the CCIP for all of its weapons, the CCRP for its bombs, along with a laser designator. It can also take the Mercury targeting pod that adds a much better field of view, a stronger optical zoom, and night vision, but no thermals. Plus, the Su-39 gets the L-166S1 infrared countermeasure system, which I'll go into later in the review. The Su-39 can also take the Kopyo-25 radar set as an external pod. This radar is surprisingly good, with a look-down head-on and a look-down all-aspect mode. It's got a track-while scan mode, an ACM boresight mode, and a ground targeting mode. This has the ability to detect, track, and target moving objects on the ground. The loadouts this jet gets are crazy, with 8 pylons for air-to-ground weapons, 2 air-to-air missiles, and the centerline utility pylon. Its air-to-air missile is the R-60M. This is an all-aspect version of the basic R-60, which is easy to target and pulse hard, but it has short range and it's pretty easy to flare off. For air-to-ground weapons, you get a good selection of dumb bombs, rocket pods, and guided munitions. You can take laser-guided missiles, including the KH-25ML, the S-25L, or the KH-29L. These are all perfectly viable weapons, with the KH-29L standing out as the heaviest hitter. For TV-guided weapons, you can take the CAB 500KR TV-guided bomb and the KH-29T. The bomb ends up being not as useful on this plane, since you really can't climb high enough to use it most of the time. But the KH-29T is another standout weapon, with good range, fire and forget capability, and an enormous warhead. The Su-39 also gets the 9K-127 Vikhr missile. This was previously exclusive to helicopters, but now it's on a jet. This is a beam-riding weapon with a very potent tandem heat warhead, And you can take up to 16 of them, making it a very good value in terms of weapon pylon space. We'll talk more about this one later. The flight performance of the Su-39 isn't great, considering its battle rating. Like the other jets in the Su-25 family, it's strictly subsonic with a relatively low wing rip speed, a little over 950 kilometers an hour. This means that you're going to need to watch your speed pretty carefully, especially when diving in for an attack, and don't forget about the air brakes. Unlike most other high-tier jets, you need to get out of the habit of flying around at 100% throttle. Try cruising at around 80 to 85%. Plus, this jet is incredibly heavy and it doesn't maneuver well in most situations. This gets even worse when you load up the wings with a few thousand kilograms of air-to-ground weapons. And if another aircraft jumps you while you're still holding all of your ordnance, it's going to be bad news. Plus, the climb rate is also not good for a top-tier jet, which impacts combat tactics quite a bit. The flip side is that this jet has actual armor and is far more resistant to battle damage than other aircraft. I included a couple of clips in this review specifically to show off the survivability rather than just its flight performance and combat tactics to try and illustrate the point. Personally, I find it kind of insane that a jet this tough has such a low wing rip speed, but oh well. Flying the Su-39 into air battles can be painful. This jet is at BR 11.3 because of its weapon system, but to be very blunt, it ends up being almost useless in top-tier air battles under the current matchmaking meta. The primary issue is the low top speed. Your entire team is going to leave you behind, leaving you out as open bait for interception, and you're usually going to be flying solo with wings full of bombs and stuff, getting jumped before you get into range of any ground targets. If you somehow get there, you can wipe out an enormous amount of trash from the map, but you usually won't get the opportunity. In terms of bringing the Su-39 into air combat, well, try not to. The R-60M ends up being a very situational weapon of last resort, and realistically, you're only going to be getting air-to-air kills in this thing if you can catch somebody off guard or if they make huge mistakes in their air combat maneuvering. You might be tempted to try using the Vikhrs in head-on attacks, but that really doesn't work as reliably as you might hope, and they end up being really easy to dodge. Plus, taking the big racks of them cripples your flight performance, so if the head-on gambit doesn't work, you're basically screwed. Oh, and this thing isn't very good at dodging missiles, so the instant anybody fires a semi-active radar missile at you, you're usually as good as dead, unless you get super lucky with chaff or something. For close air support, well, I've got some really mixed feelings about this plane, and I think a lot of players are going to get a little frustrated with it. The jet ends up with this dichotomy where its offensive weapon system is really one of the best in the game, but its flight performance just cripples it, even in its intended role. The real problem is that it just can't climb. Now, since it's in the Soviet tech tree, you won't usually have to worry about going up against the Pantsir, but you still have to contend with the Tor, ADATs, and half a dozen other modern SAM systems that can get around your countermeasures pretty easily. The normal meta at top tier right now is to use guided weapons from super high altitude to avoid detection. But the Su-39 can't really do that. 90% of the time that you get the spawn points to use this thing with a good weapons loadout, there won't be enough time left in the match for you to side climb for 3 or 4 minutes, and even then, you end up incredibly vulnerable to interception by enemy fighters. This forces the Su-39 into very high-risk, low-altitude combat. Its weapon system works great for this, but you're going to get shot down a lot, and considering that this is a premium jet that people are paying real money for, just something to think about. It's not bad at close air support, not by a long shot, and it's a lot tougher than other planes. You will sometimes just bounce missiles off of this thing with seemingly no damage. But the meta forces you to fly this incredibly dangerously, and even as tough as this thing is, it's gonna get shot down more than you think. Also, shameless plug for my tutorial on using air-to-ground weapons, which I'll link in a pinned comment if you need a refresher. Okay, let's talk about the new toys. This thing gets the beam-riding Vikhr missile, which is currently one of the best helicopter-mounted weapons in the game, now on a jet. They might seem a little weird to use at first, but the secret is that after you select a target, you have to aim your plane a little above it before it's going to let you fire. The Vikhr has a very narrow angle for targeting, and so if you're trying to just point directly at your target, it might seem like something is wrong and it won't let you shoot. Just pull up a tiny bit and you'll be fine. When you lock on a ground target and you have the Vikhr selected, you're going to see a wide rectangle flash in the air for a moment. Aim for that and you'll be fine. Now, since this is a beam-riding weapon, you have to keep the target selected until the missile hits, but you can pull off a little bit. The Vikhrs have a proximity fuse, so just remember that sometimes they're going to get shot down, especially if you're jousting with an SPAA, and you might have to just keep firing these things if the first few don't make it. Good news is, you've got tons of them. With the infrared countermeasure unit, which is that round pie-looking thing just below the rudder, this is another system that's been in the game for helicopters but is new to jets. What it actually does is try to confuse the targeting of IR-guided missiles coming at you from behind by rotating an overly strong artificial infrared source. It doesn't always work, but it sometimes is going to spoof a missile so it flies off and misses at the last second. And it's generally going to be more effective against outdated missiles, obviously. But the key takeaway for right now is that it's not perfect and you can still get shot down by IR missiles, especially SAMs that have electronic countermeasure functions. However, sometimes heat seekers will get spoofed by this thing at the last second before impact. The good news is that fighter pilots in the game haven't really figured out what to do about this yet, so they're usually not going to shoot heat seekers at you in air combat because they don't want to waste a missile. The bad news is they're just going to gun you out instead. Visually, I think all the Su-25 jets look pretty badass, and the 39 is no different. It's just covered in weapons and sensors and stuff, and it looks really obviously built for heavy combat. There are two skins that you can use for it, both of them are pretty decent, but personally I prefer the default blue. Landing the Su-39 isn't too difficult, with the only real caveat being that this is a very heavy jet, so you might need to throttle a little bit more than you think coming in on final. It gets drag chutes, which help the landing run considerably. The cockpit on the Su-39 is pretty decent for a ground pounder. The visibility is average, at least to the front and sides, and you get a useful heads-up display and an SPI monitor in a good spot. No functional radar warning receiver though, and some of the important instruments are a tiny bit lower than I personally prefer. To close out on the premium Su-39. This jet has an amazing targeting system. It gets an air-to-ground radar pod along with an infrared countermeasure system. It carries an enormous amount of weapons, and it's very resistant to battle damage. However, it has a really low top speed. It's almost useless in air combat. Its rate of climb is very low for top tier, and it's very expensive. The final verdict on the Su-39 is that this jet is the perfect example of why planes should have different battle ratings for air and ground modes. It's almost useless in air battle games, but it does okay in close air support if you can avoid incoming SAMs. Oh, and did I mention that it's very expensive? As always, thanks for watching.